Well, hi, everybody. I'm Don Stewart, and welcome to episode 32 of Evil Angels, Demons, and the Occult, the Dark World. We're still on Appendix 3, looking at the question, are the sons of God in Genesis chapter 6, verses 1 to 4, referring to angels? And we're on the third part of our discussion. Now, we started this at episode 25, if you've been following with us. Basically, the first episode was an introduction to the question. And then what we did, we gave 20 specific points that everyone can agree upon about what the scripture has to say about angels, the flood, etc. And that's our starting point. And since then, what we've been doing, part 2, is looking at 14 specific arguments that are given by people who believe that angels are indeed the sons of God in Genesis chapter 6. So we went through those 14 arguments and gave the response to each one of them. And we came to the conclusion that the arguments just are not convincing. They just don't make the case. Now, what we're going to do now, after looking at these 14 reasons why, we're going to look at two problems with the angel view. First, the general problem, and then specific problems. We're going to look at 3 general problems to start with respect to the angel view. Then we're going to look at 20 specific issues that we believe make the angel view basically impossible to be the correct view. All right, so here we go. Not only is the evidence lacking for the angelic view of Genesis chapter 6, verses 1 through 4, we find that in addition, there are many other problems with this perspective. This can be summed up under 2 basic categories, namely general problems and specific problems. So first, let's look at general problems with the angelic view. At the outset, there are 3 general problems with the angelic view of the identity of the sons of God, which we should appreciate. General problem 1. We must interpret difficult passages by those that are clear. One of the basic rules of Bible interpretation is that we must interpret the passages that are difficult to understand by those which are clear. Furthermore, everyone agrees that Genesis 6 is one of the most difficult passages in the entire Bible to interpret. Consequently, whatever conclusions one may make, it must agree with the totality of Scripture. What we find is that there are no clear passages elsewhere in the Bible which teach that angels sinned by having sexual relationships with earthly women. None. And we've emphasized that point. We will continue to emphasize no passage whatsoever, clear passage that teaches that. That's general problem 1. Now, general problem 2, we should never use one single controversial passage to establish biblical doctrine. Now, this next point is crucial. We never want to make a doctrine out of a single passage that can be interpreted in a number of possible ways. Never. But this is exactly what has been done with the angelic view. While there are other passages which can possibly be seen in support of this particular interpretation of Genesis 6, 1 to 4, those passages are anything but clear. In fact, as we have documented, there are other explanations that are as persuasive, if not more persuasive, than the angelic explanation. And finally, general problem 3, each argument for the angelic view has had a reasonable response. As we just observed, each and every argument that's been put forward in favor of the angelic view has received a reasoned response. In other words, it is by no means clear that the Lord has intended us to understand that we are dealing with angelic sin in this passage in the 6th chapter of Genesis. Now, add to this, the previous 2 points we just mentioned shows that the angelic view, though held by many good interpreters, I mean many good interpreters, should never be seen as the way to understand this particular episode. Indeed, there are much better options. So again, 3 general problems. First, we must interpret difficult passages by those that are clear. Second problem, we should never use one single controversial passage to establish biblical doctrine. And the third problem with this theory, each argument for the angelic view, as we have seen, has a reasonable response. All right, now, specific problems with the angelic view that must be answered by those who hold this position. So as we continue, there is more. We will now list a number of specific problems with the angelic interpretation of Genesis chapter 6, verses 1 to 4, that shows that it is extremely difficult, if not impossible, to assume that this is the correct understanding of the passage. Now, this includes some of the 20 points that we stressed at the beginning of this question. things that we know for certain from Scripture about this subject. Consequently, there's going to be some repetition of what we have already stated. Now, in addition, in our book, The Sons of God, the Flood, and the Tower of Babel, Genesis chapter 4 through 11, we go into great detail about the sinful history of the people after the fall of Adam and Eve. As we document, it was lawlessness and violence of those days. Basically, that's what led the Lord to send a flood in the first place, to destroy who? The inhabitants of the earth. Lawlessness on their part and violence on their part, to the point it was the sin of humanity that caused the judgment of the flood. It had nothing to do with angels or any other divine beings. Accordingly, those who hold the angelic view of the sons of God must be able to give reasonable answers to the following problems that we will raise if they are to make their case. So let's start going through them. Problem 1. There is nothing in the immediate context of Genesis 6 that supports the angel view. Now, this is one of the many problems with this theory, and it is indeed huge. The view that these sons of God are actually angels who sin by marrying earthly women makes no sense whatsoever in the context of Genesis. First, we do not find anything in the immediate context that angels are in view. Indeed, in this context, we have the genealogies of 10 mighty men listed in Genesis chapter 5. Then in Genesis 6, we have the emphasis that it was human sin that caused the flood. Note the following statements of the Lord. But the Lord saw the wickedness of humankind had become great on the earth. Genesis 6:5. So the Lord was sorry that he had made mankind on the earth, and he was grieved in his heart. Genesis 6:6. Then the Lord said, I will wipe out mankind whom I have created from the face of the land, mankind, for I am sorry that I have made them. That's Genesis chapter 6 and verse 7. Now, these verses here are merely illustrative of what the entire narrative states. In fact, 9 times in this context of the flood account, it is human sin that is specifically mentioned as the cause for the Lord to send his punishment upon the earth by means of a flood. 9 separate times. In contrast, there is absolutely nothing in this passage that has to do with angels, nothing whatsoever. In fact, there's not even an idea remotely given to us that angels had anything to do with the cause of God's judgment on the earth in the immediate context of Genesis 6. What we do discover is that the continual sin of those who lived before the flood had now reached the point where the Lord had to intervene. The marriages of the sons of God with the daughters of men are possibly the proverbial nail in the coffin, as the context may indicate. We will talk more about that later. We read about from the Ashbury commentary, the spread and intensifying of sin depicted in earlier chapters reaches its peak in chapter 6 with the intermarriage of the sons of God with the daughters of men. The sons of God is more likely to mean Seth's progeny, which the context of 4:25 to 26 might imply. That's from the Ashbury Bible commentary. All right, and many people hold that view, by the way. Therefore, in the eyes of the Lord, the human race had come to the place where punishment was necessary. Since humanity alone was specifically said to be judged, this is a huge problem for the angelic view, a problem for which there is really no good explanation. All right, problem number 2. The broader context does not support the angel theory. As we have also indicated, in the broader context of Genesis 1 through 11, the subject matter is exclusively God and humans. Judgment of angels is nowhere to be found. In fact, angels are nowhere to be found. We emphasize that angels, those who are God's invisible messengers, have not been mentioned in the book of Genesis to this point, and certainly nothing in the account demands that we understand the sons of God as angels. Again, the focus is on the punishment of humans for their sins by means of a flood as well as its aftermath. There is no reference in the overall flood narrative to the guilt of angels, none. Indeed, it is only these 2 instances of the phrase sons of God in Genesis chapter 6, verses 2 and 4, where anyone could claim that angels are the subject matter. Other than these 2 references, there is nothing else. In fact, without these 2 references, the idea of any angelic involvement would have never been an issue. Let me mention that again, because this is very important. Without these two verses, Genesis 6:2 and 6:4, where it talks about the sons of God, B'nai Ha-Elohim in Hebrew, without them, that no one anywhere whatsoever would come up with the idea that angels were involved in the flood account, because there's nothing else anywhere that even remotely hints at something like this. Furthermore, as we will emphasize, this phrase in the context of Genesis 6 is not definitive in supporting the claim that angels or other supernatural beings are the focus in this context. Therefore, the fact that angels have not been introduced to the reader in the Genesis account to this time is a huge argument against them being the main subject of this chapter. Note the observations of the Moody Bible Commentary. It says this, quote, "The long-standing and popular the view that the sons of God in verse 2 are angels who sin by marrying human women is to be dismissed, since it makes no contextual sense, whether in the immediate context of verse 3, in which God's reaction is exclusively toward man, the slightly larger context of what precedes and follows, that is Adam's genealogy and the flood, both focused on man, not angels, or the broader thematic context of Genesis, this first half, of which chapters 1 through 11 represents God's prosecution of human, not angelic depravity," close quote. All right, nothing from the context even remotely refers to angels in the first 11 chapters of Genesis. Now, we should also know what Genesis 6:3 says in the context. It reads as follows, "Then the Lord said, My spirit will not remain with man forever, because he also is flesh. Nevertheless, his days shall be 120 years. Genesis chapter 6 and verse 3. Now, Hebrew scholar John Sailhammer explains Genesis 6:3 and how this verse relates to the overall context of Genesis, namely that humans and only humans are in view. The sense, and quote, "The sense of verse 3 is clear if read within the context of what precedes and follows. After creating humans as male and female, God called them man, Adam, in chapter 5, verse 2, which obviously had a wider scope than the personal individual in chapter 4. After focusing on the lives of 10 individuals in chapter 5, God speaks a second time about man, chapter 6 and verse 3. The ages of the men in those intervening verses stand in stark contrast to the 120 years mentioned in this verse. The inference is that it was God's Spirit dwelling with these men that gave them their long lives. The sad reality is that such long lives belong to another age, and they were exceptions rather than the rule. Thus, the author continues to show the ages of the men of the book and notes that generally their ages grew increasingly shorter. At the close of the Pentateuch, we find each individual, and finally an individual named Moses, who is specifically mentioned as dying at the age of 120 years. So in the close of the Pentateuch of these first 5 books, we find an individual, Moses, who specifically is mentioned as dying at the age of 120. Again, and that's from John Sailhammer. So again, we stress the emphasis in the first 11 chapters of Genesis is on humans, male and female. It has nothing to do with angels. Accordingly, the context of Genesis 1 through 11 gives no basis whatsoever of seeing the sons of God as angels or any other type of supernatural being. Again, as Sailhammer mentioned, the before and after Genesis 6, it's all about humanity. Now, consequently, this problem is one in which those advocating the angelic view are not able to give a satisfactory answer, especially if one of the primary causes for God sending the flood was angelic sin. So the point that we've made so far in these first 2 problems, it's all about humanity, all about mankind, before, after, their ages, etc., etc. It has nothing to do with any other creation, animals or angels or whatever it might be. It's all about the sin of human beings. All right, problem number 3. The meaning of the phrase sons of God in Genesis 6 is not a clear reference to angels. Now, as we noted, the Hebrew phrase translated sons of God is not a clear reference to angels in chapter 6. Indeed, the 2 references to the precise Hebrew phrase sons of God in other parts of Scripture are insufficient data to base our understanding of the meaning of the term. In addition, the sons of God mentioned in the early chapters of Job clearly refer to heavenly beings, but not necessarily to angels. Angels have a unique ministry among the supernatural beings that the Lord has created. They do his bidding. However, other heavenly beings that Scripture mentions, the cherubim, the seraphim, the living creatures, all seem to reside in heaven and seemingly have a different function than angels. Therefore, it is possible that the sons of God referred to in the book of Job may be another class of heavenly beings apart from the angels. There is simply not enough evidence to be certain one way or another. We read in Job chapter 1, verse 6 and chapter 2, verse 1 that the sons of God presented themselves to the Lord. Were they angels? Possibly some other type of supernatural being. All right, let's move on. Here next point, Moses calls the people of Israel sons of God. There's another essential point that must be stressed. As we have previously noted, there's also the fact that elsewhere in Scripture, the nation of Israel is called the sons of the living God and the sons of the Lord your God. For example, in Deuteronomy 14:1, we read, "You are the sons of the Lord your God. You shall not cut yourselves or make any baldness on your foreheads for the dead." Deuteronomy chapter 14 and verse 1. Now, interestingly, the Baylor Handbook on the Hebrew Bible makes the following observations concerning this verse. Here, the complement sons has been fronted in the passage to signal the introduction of a new topic, that is, the identity of the people of Israel as who? As sons of God. Deuteronomy 14, 1-2, sons you are. And that's from the Baylor Handbook on the Hebrew Bible, Deuteronomy 12 through 26. Now note that these Hebrew scholars, on their technical grammatical study on the text of this portion of Deuteronomy, underscore the fact that this sentence was written in such a way as to emphasize the identity of the nation of Israel as the sons of God as they're about to enter into the promised land. Now, they also make this important observation. The following laws are motivated by this opening identity statement, which establishes Israel's kinship with the Lord, Yahweh. This kinship relationship must supersede commitments to biological family if they incite rebellion, Deuteronomy 13, 7-12, and Israel's commitment to Yahweh must supersede expressing commitments to deceased ancestors through the mourning rites of the Canaanites and other neighbors that are considered idolatrous, close quote. Now, in this context, the Lord was about to list the laws that his chosen people Israel were now to obey. Remember, Deuteronomy, the second law, that's what the word means. They're about to enter the promised land. So what he's doing, he's listing the laws that the chosen people must obey when they go into the promised land. However, he first emphasized their special relationship with him. Indeed, commitment to him was more important than any biological relationship they may have. Why? Because they are his children in a unique sense, namely the sons of God. In fact, the very next verse stresses this truth. For you are a holy people to the Lord your God, and the Lord has chosen you to be a people for his treasured possession out of all of the peoples who are on the face of the earth. Deuteronomy 14:2. Accordingly, let us not miss the fact that this description of the people of Israel is used by the same author, Moses, who compiled Genesis. Therefore, the phrase sons of God in another context of the Pentateuch, that is the first 5 books of the Bible, refers here to humans, not angels. So you have a human reference by the author, Moses, to the sons of God in Deuteronomy 14, chapter 14, verses 1-2. And so what we find so far is that not only is there's nothing in the context of Genesis 6, in the immediate context, 6-8, or the context before 1-5 or 7-11, that angels are involved. We also find that the meaning of this phrase, sons of God, is anything but a clear reference to angels, simply because we find the same reference by the same author in Deuteronomy chapter 14, where it's emphatic. You, basically, it's been fronted. You are the people, the sons of the living God you are, emphasizing they have this unique relationship with him. And so we need to keep that in mind as we go on. Now, we're going to also find out next time there's other ways this phrase may be translated. So we're not stuck with just the phrase sons of the living God or sons of God in Genesis 6, 2-4. But we're going to wait until next time to get to that because we're out of time for this first episode in part 3, episode 32, and our going through evil angels, demons, the occult. But it's the first in part 3 as we go through the various problems that the angelic theory has. We've already mentioned mentioned 3 of them. There are huge problems. Nothing in the context before, nothing in the context after, nothing in the context of the first 11 chapters. And the phrase B'nai Ha-Elohim in Hebrew, sons of God, although it's listed there in 6:2 and 6:4, it's not listed again in the first 5 books, except in Deuteronomy, very closely a phrase in Deuteronomy 14:1, which speaks of human beings, Israel, as the sons of the living God. And so we need to keep that in mind. All right, we'll continue on next time and give some more problems that are there and give the reasons why we do not think the sons of God being angels is the best answer to the question of Genesis chapter 6. Until then, I'm Don Stewart. Thanks for watching, and may the Lord richly, richly bless you.